The midday sun blazed over Camp Pendleton, California, washing the hills in a hard, white light. Heat shimmered across the sprawling Marine base, but the air itself was unusually calm. No breeze, no shifting haze. Perfect weather for a live fire sniper demonstration. Rows of bleachers faced a long, dry canyon. Generals in crisp uniforms occupied the first row, their medals catching the light. Behind them, civilian dignitaries, defense contractors, and a half-dozen journalists leaned forward with notepads ready. A few photographers perched their cameras on tripods, waiting for the moment the United States Marine Corps would once again prove its precision. At the firing line, two sniper teams crouched behind their rifles, scopes glinting. Spotters murmured into headsets. The range stretched half a mile to a series of steel targets, each one barely wider than a man's chest and painted in fresh white. Captain Mark Reynolds, lead instructor of the Marine Sniper School, paced behind his shooters with the easy authority of a man who had logged years in combat zones. His uniform sleeves were rolled tight, revealing forearms lined with rope muscle and sunburn. He'd planned this demonstration for months, an opportunity to impress brass and reassure politicians that the Corps' legendary sharpshooters hadn't lost their edge. "Range is clear," a range officer announced over the loudspeaker. Reynolds nodded. "Let's show them how it's done. Target Alpha, 500 yards." The first shooter settled, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. Crack. Dust puffed a foot wide of the target. No clang of metal. A quiet murmur rippled through the bleachers. The second shooter fired. Another clean miss. Reynolds' jaw tightened. "Wind reading?" he asked the spotter. 0.3 from the west. "Practically nothing," the spotter replied. "Adjust half a click and fire again." Two more shots, two more misses. Up in the stands, a few reporters exchanged skeptical smiles. Cameras clicked, catching the moment. A general tapped his watch, then scribbled a note. Reynolds crouched beside his men, checking the rifles, the optics, the ammo. Everything was immaculate. "No excuses," he muttered. "You know your fundamentals." Again, the next volley echoed downrange. Crack, crack. Still no satisfying ring of steel. A restless energy spread across the spectators. Perfect weather, perfect rifles. And yet the Marines, heirs to a century of marksmanship tradition, couldn't land a single hit. At the far edge of the bleachers, a gray-haired man in a faded ball cap sat with arms folded. He looked like any retiree you might see at a small-town diner. Soft flannel shirt, sun-creased skin, posture slightly stooped. But his eyes were sharp and steady, following every shot, every ripple of dust near the targets. The patch on his old cap read simply, USMC. This was Jack Carter, though no one on the range seemed to recognize the name. Jack had arrived quietly before the event began, offering only a polite nod to the sentry at the gate. He carried no camera, no phone, just a thermos of black coffee. For nearly an hour he'd watched in silence, his gaze never leaving the canyon wall to the right of the targets, a wall of jagged stone that jutted into the afternoon sun like the prow of a ship. Another miss. A young journalist near Jack whispered to her colleague, "Is this for real? Maybe they're using the wrong ammo." Jack leaned forward slightly, his weathered face unreadable. He'd seen this before, the kind of invisible mischief nature plays on men who think they've mastered it. Down at the line, Captain Reynolds ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. Sweat darkened the back of his collar. He signaled for a short pause and strode toward the ammo crates, double-checking lot numbers as though a mislabeled round could explain the embarrassment. Jack set his thermos down and rose, easing creaky knees. He stepped to the rails separating the bleachers from the firing area and waited until Reynolds passed close enough to hear a low voice. "Captain," Jack said evenly, "you've got a hidden crosswind rolling off that canyon wall. 2 clicks right should put you on target." Reynolds stopped, startled. He turned to see only the gray-haired stranger. "Appreciate the input, Grandpa," Reynolds said, forcing a grin. "We've got it handled." A couple of Marines within earshot chuckled. One of the younger shooters muttered something under his breath that drew another round of quiet laughs. Jack merely nodded once and folded his arms again. Reynolds returned to the line, irritation flickering in his eyes. He whispered to his spotter, "Where do these civilians get off? Hidden crosswind. There's nothing out there." But when the next round went downrange, the result was identical. A faint puff of dust, a full foot to the left of the target. From the bleachers came a few groans. A reporter scribbled "Marines miss again" in bold strokes. The brass at the front shifted, their expressions tightening. Captain Reynolds' confidence began to fray. He knew every eye was on him. Generals expecting results, journalists smelling blood, dignitaries comparing this to other branches. Pride whispered that he could solve it alone. Logic warned that something unseen was at play. He chose pride, signaling for another reload. The shooters adjusted, steadied, and fired. Crack, crack. Nothing. A murmur spread like wildfire. One general leaned toward another and muttered, "This is turning into a fiasco." Only Jack Carter remained motionless, gaze fixed on the canyon wall where faint, shifting eddies of dust betrayed the truth to anyone patient enough to see. The echo of the last missed shot faded into a heavy silence. Even the gulls that wheeled over Camp Pendleton seemed to pause, as if curious about the humiliation unfolding below. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised to capture every detail of the Marines' failure. Camera shutters snapped like small bursts of gunfire. A defense contractor in a tailored suit whispered to a general, the words too low to catch but the smirk unmistakable. Captain Mark Reynolds forced his breathing to slow. He knew how this looked. A premier sniper school unable to hit a barn door on a calm California afternoon. He knelt beside the first shooter and checked the rifle's action again, his jaw tight enough to ache. Perfect. Everything was perfect except the shots. Behind the firing line, the young Marines exchanged uneasy glances. They'd trained for years, each with expert badges and commendations, but now their reputation was bleeding out one miss at a time. Reynolds barked, "Reset. 500-yard target. Let's get a hit and shut them up." The shooter inhaled, exhaled, squeezed. Crack. The bullet sliced the air and smacked the dirt, left of the steel plate yet again. A ripple of chuckles rose from the bleachers. A journalist's voice carried just enough to sting. "Maybe the legend of Marine snipers is a bit overrated." Reynolds stiffened. Pride flared hot in his chest. But deeper than pride was the sinking knowledge that something real and unseen was beating him. At the far end of the stands, Jack Carter remained a statue of calm. He'd spent a lifetime reading wind and terrain, and he recognized the subtle swirl curling off the canyon wall, the kind of devilish crosswind invisible to instruments but merciless to bullets. He'd warned the captain once. That was enough. Jack sipped the last of his black coffee and set the empty thermos beside his boot. The memory of other ranges, other wars, slid through his mind. Rice paddies in Vietnam, endless dunes in Kuwait, the eerie silence just before dawn when a single shot could change the course of a mission. Another shot rang out. Another miss. Finally, a gravelly voice from the front row cut through the murmurs. Major General Ellison, a veteran of 3 combat tours, stood and faced Reynolds. "Captain," he said, his command sharp as a rifle crack, "this is becoming a spectacle. Who is that man offering advice?" Reynolds blinked, caught off guard. "Just a civilian observer, sir." "Then maybe it's time the civilian had the floor," Ellison said. His gray brows lifted, daring anyone to argue. Every head turned toward the quiet figure in the worn ball cap. Jack Carter unfolded his long frame from the bleacher. Despite the years etched into his face, his posture straightened with an almost unconscious discipline. He stepped down to the range, boots crunching on gravel. The young Marines instinctively parted, an unspoken recognition that something about this man commanded space. Reynolds tried for authority. "Sir, with respect, this is a controlled." Ellison cut him off. "Captain, the floor is his." Jack reached the firing line and crouched beside the nearest rifle. He didn't touch it yet. Instead, he lifted his chin toward the canyon wall, where a thin veil of dust swirled like smoke from an invisible fire. "Wind's rolling off that rock face," he said, voice low but carrying. "Starts calm, then kicks sideways just before the target. 2 clicks right, maybe a hair more. You'll never see it on your gauge, but it's there." The spotter frowned, then glanced through his scope toward the canyon. His eyes widened as he caught the faint shimmer Jack had seen all along. He's right," the spotter whispered. Jack eased behind the rifle. moving with the slow confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He adjusted the scope. 2 precise clicks right, a subtle correction to elevation, and settled the stock into his shoulder. The range fell silent. Even the skeptical reporters seemed to hold their breath. Jack exhaled, finger brushing the trigger. Crack! A heartbeat later, a perfect metallic clang echoed across the canyon. The steel plate rocked, a small puff of white paint flaking away. The crowd erupted. Gasps, cheers, a few stunned curses. Cameras flashed like lightning. Jack didn't smile. He simply flicked the safety on, lifted the rifle gently from the rest, and stood. "That's your crosswind," he said, offering the rifle back to the astonished Marine. "Respect the terrain, and it'll respect you." For a long moment, no one spoke. The young shooters stared as though they'd seen a ghost. Captain Reynolds felt the heat of embarrassment creep up his neck, but mingled with it was something unexpected: admiration. General Ellison broke the silence. "Name?" he asked the quiet stranger. Jack gave a small nod. "Carter. Jack Carter." The range officer, curious, pulled a roster tablet from his satchel and began scrolling. A few seconds later he froze, eyes widening. "Sir," he said, voice rising with astonishment. "Gunnery Sergeant Jack Carter, retired. Vietnam. Desert Storm. Holds a record for the longest confirmed sniper shot in Marine Corps history." A collective gasp swept the bleachers. The reporters who had been smirking now scribbled furiously. A few Marines straightened unconsciously, spines stiffening as if on inspection. Reynolds swallowed hard. He'd heard the name, every sniper had. The legendary Gunny Carter, whose impossible shots were still studied in training schools around the world. Jack simply adjusted his cap, the silver Marine Corps emblem inside, catching a glint of sunlight. "I served," he said softly. Nothing more to it. The laughter that had followed his first warning was gone. In its place grew a reverent silence. The hush that followed the range officer's announcement carried more weight than any shouted command. Even the Pacific breeze seemed to pause as the truth of the name, Gunnery Sergeant Jack Carter, settled over the crowd. General Ellison straightened to full height, his voice resonant but edged with a quiet respect. "Gunny Carter," he said, "the honor is ours." He gave a crisp salute. Jack inclined his head in acknowledgement, neither basking in the moment nor brushing it aside. His eyes, a steel gray that had once measured jungle humidity and desert mirages, moved from the general to the young Marines still frozen at the firing line. Captain Mark Reynolds felt the weight of those eyes. All his years of training, every hard-earned qualification badge, seemed suddenly like the first rungs of a ladder Jack had climbed decades ago. Reynolds stepped forward, shoulders square, but chin slightly lowered. "Gunny," he said, the title tasting humbler than he expected, "I owe you an apology. I dismissed your advice." Jack studied him for a heartbeat, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Pride can be a heavier crosswind than any canyon breeze," he said. "Every Marine fights it. You'll win if you stay teachable." A few reporters shifted, sensing the quote of the day. Jack gestured toward the rifles. "Let's finish what you started." The young sniper whose shots had gone astray earlier stepped forward, cheeks flushed. Jack motioned him to the stock and crouched beside him like a patient mentor. "Feel that shift," he murmured. "See the shimmer along the rock wall? That's your enemy. 2 clicks right, slow breath. Let the trigger surprise you." The Marine inhaled, exhaled, and fired. Clang! The bullet rang true, dead center. A ripple of cheers swept across the bleachers. Another shooter took position. Again Jack guided. No wasted words, just subtle corrections. Clang! Another perfect strike. One by one the recruits found the target, their confidence rebuilding with each resonant hit. Even the skeptical journalists began scribbling furiously, the narrative of Marine failure rewritten in real time. General Ellison moved closer, his eyes never leaving the line of shooters. "Gunny, you've still got the touch." Jack allowed the faintest smile. "Skill fades if you stop using it. But respect for the craft, that never goes." Reynolds exhaled, a mixture of relief and admiration in his face. He extended his hand. "Gunny Carter, It would be an honor if you'd spend a few days with the unit. Share some of what you know. Jack shook the offered hand, grip firm but unassuming. I'm just passing through, Captain, but I'll give you this. He tapped the Marine's chest lightly, right where the heart beat. Wind, terrain, patience. Learn those, and you'll never truly miss. The words carried farther than any bullet. From the back of the bleachers, a young recruit, barely 19, called out impulsively, "Gunny, is it true you made a shot over 2,000 yards in the Gulf?" Jack turned, eyes narrowing slightly as memories surfaced. The long desert dawn, the trembling mirage, the necessity of a single impossible shot. He gave a small shrug. Records belong to history. Lives belong to the living. Remember that. The crowd absorbed the lesson, silence heavier than applause. Ellison broke it at last. "Men," he said to the assembled Marines, "you've just been schooled by one of the finest marksmen to wear the uniform. Take this day to heart. Skill matters, but humility and respect matter more." He turned to Jack again. "Gunny, if you ever want a place here, the Corps will find it." Jack looked past the general toward the rolling hills and the thin line of ocean beyond. For a moment the years seemed to fold inward. Vietnam's humid nights, the acrid sands of Kuwait, friends who'd never made it home. "I had my time," he said quietly. "Now it's theirs." He tipped his cap, the silver Marine emblem flashing in the California sun. "Keep them sharp, Captain. The next fight belongs to them." With that, he stepped back from the firing line, letting the young Marines continue without him. Each shooter hit steel now, the rhythm of crack, clang carrying across the canyon like a heartbeat restored. Reporters lowered their cameras, sensing the story's true weight wasn't in the headline, but in the silence that followed each perfect shot. Jack reached the edge of the range where the gravel met the pavement. The sound of the ocean reached him, a low, steady roar beyond the distant hills. He paused only long enough to glance back. The Marines were lined in disciplined formation, rifles ready, faces set with newfound purpose. Reynolds raised his hand in salute. The entire line followed, a single motion crisp and respectful. Jack returned the salute with a subtle lift of his cap. Then he turned toward the setting sun, boots crunching softly, and began the quiet walk back to the parking lot. The late afternoon sun settled low over Camp Pendleton, painting the scrub hills in amber and gold. On the range behind him, rifle fire cracked in steady rhythm. No longer the erratic stumbles of the morning, but the measured precision of shooters who had rediscovered their confidence. Jack Carter paused at the edge of the gravel lot and looked back one last time. The young Marines were still working the line, their movements sharper now, every adjustment deliberate. They'd carry today into the rest of their careers, he thought. Not the single shot he'd fired, but the lesson that rode in its wake. Captain Mark Reynolds jogged up from the firing line, dust rising around his boots. "Gunny," he called. Jack stopped and turned, his silhouette framed by the deepening glow of the western sky. Reynolds slowed as he reached him, breathing hard but standing straight. "I know you said you were just passing through," the captain said, "but the Corps could use you. Even a few days of instruction would change these men." "Sir, it would change me." Jack regarded him with the calm patience that had defined a lifetime behind the scope. "You don't need me to stay," he replied. "You just need to remember what you already know. Respect the terrain, respect the craft, respect each other. Pride will throw you off target faster than any wind." Reynolds gave a slow nod. "I hear you." He hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry for how I spoke to you earlier. I thought you were just an old man with opinions." Jack finished, a faint smile creasing the lines at the corners of his eyes. Reynolds flushed. "Yes, sir." Jack extended his hand. Then were square. They shook, firm and brief. As Reynolds turned back toward the range, Jack lingered a moment, letting the ocean breeze wash over him. The scent of salt carried echoes of other coasts. The humid bite of Anong, the dry heat of Kuwait, the briny chill of Norfolk where he'd first trained young snipers decades ago. Faces came with those memories, friends and teammates who had never come home. He could still hear their laughter between missions, still feel the weight of their absence. That was the real reason he had stopped at Pendleton when his road trip took him near the coast. Not nostalgia, Exactly, but a need to be near the sound of Marine rifles again to know the line of service had not been broken. A pair of recruits trotted past on their way to the armory, giving him crisp nods. Jack returned a subtle salute. They didn't know his stories in detail, and they didn't need to. All that mattered was that they'd seen what experience looked like and recognized its value. Farther back, the cluster of reporters had turned from skeptics into scribes of reverence. The one who had mocked Marine accuracy earlier now spoke softly into a recorder. An unexpected masterclass in humility, delivered by a veteran whose single shot reminded everyone that skill and wisdom endure long after youth fades. Jack caught only fragments, but it was enough. The headlines would write themselves, but he hoped the essence survived. Not the record-breaking distance of shot, but the quiet discipline that made such a shot possible. The parking lot was nearly empty. Jack's old pickup waited under a leaning eucalyptus tree, its paint faded by decades of sun. He slid in the driver's seat, the familiar creak of worn springs greeting him like an old friend. Before starting the engine, he rested both hands on the steering wheel and allowed a long breath to escape. Another day, another lesson passed on. He didn't crave ceremony or recognition. He never had. The real satisfaction lay in knowing the next generation would carry the standard forward a little wiser than before. The engine rumbled to life. Jack steered toward the exit road, tires crunching softly over the gravel. As the range receded in the side mirror, the rhythmic clang of successful shots followed him like a farewell salute. Captain Reynolds returned to the firing line, the memory of Jack's calm instruction etched deep. He addressed his Marines, voice steady. You just witnessed what a lifetime of discipline looks like. Gunnery Sergeant Carter isn't a relic. He's a standard. Remember today, every time you pick up a rifle. Wind, terrain, patience. Respect them, or you'll miss every time. The shooters nodded, their faces solemn but alight with new determination. Even the youngest, who had earlier laughed at the old guy, now handled his rifle with quiet reverence. Miles down the coastal highway, Jack rolled the window halfway and let the sea air fill the cab. The horizon burned with the last streaks of sunset, a line of crimson fading to violet. He felt the day's tension ease, replaced by a steady contentment. Somewhere behind him, the Marines continued their practice, steel targets ringing in the falling dusk. He imagined their future deployments, harsh deserts, icy mountains, places where the smallest misjudgment of wind or ego could mean failure. If today had given them even a fraction of the patience he'd learned the hard way, it was enough. Jack tipped the brim of his ball cap lower against the setting sun, the silver Marine Corps emblem catching the final light. Old doesn't mean out, he murmured to the empty road ahead. Experience wins the long fight. The pickup's taillights dwindled into the California night, leaving only the sound of distant waves and the echo of a single perfect shot that would be remembered long after the reporters filed their stories and the generals signed their reports.